Thank you very much. So thank you for the introduction. And I'll talk about, in general, privacy preserving judgment models, and more particular, when and why we would want to use synthetic data in cases where we have private or sensitive information. So I'll talk about first like the project scope and in general why we'd want that, and then do a small introduction and generative models, but nothing very in depth, and then spend more time on the experiments and concluding thoughts and further work that we could want on synthetic data and in general privacy solutions. So why do we want privacy? Well, because data sharing is really one of the main driving forces of scientific progress, and in particular in medical data and medical research. And one big issue is that patient privacy is non-negotiable, and sharing medical data can put sensitive information at risk for patients. And so the only solution for that right now is kind of anonymization, and anonymization is particularly slow and costly. So it's something that can't be applied to any type of data, and it has to be done carefully and with a lot of care. And on top of that, it actually can reduce the analytical utility and the discriminative power of such data after anonymization. So a solution that we kind of propose and evaluate here in our work is how to use generative models, and how can we generate synthetic data sets that behave in a similar manner than real data, but that don't threaten patient privacy. So once again, why is it useful? So another small thing about synthetic data is that you can use it for rebalancing data classes and so on. But the most important selling points are sharing externally and faster prototyping. So there are points where, because of patient privacy and of data privacy, data is just not shared, even though it would be very useful, but it's not possible to just justify the cost of going through anonymization. So for example, in some scientific publications, people can decide to forego anonymization because it's too costly for a paper that maybe won't even get published. Or for example, for hackathon or data challenges, it's usually toy examples or toy data, because it's not possible to share with new hires or for or small teams anonymized data, once again, because it might be too long or too expensive. And for faster prototyping, even when real data is available and is going to be anonymized, it's still something that's really tedious, and so maybe it will take months to get the data to be anonymized. And so that's where having access to synthetic data that behaves in a similar manner as real data is very useful, because instead of having to wait for months and months to get data, people can start, and different teams can start immediately on prototyping and building pipelines, for example, or testing out different architectures, because the data types is already there, and also like the data set content and behavior is already somewhat produced. So these are really the most important selling points. And a few words on what data set we worked in for our kind of proof of concept there. So we worked on a data set that's part of a collaboration between Novartis and the Oxford Big Data Institute on MRI data sets from a disease called ankylosing spondylitis, which is a spine disease. So we have MRI spine images of vertebral units. So vertebral units is a 3D volume between two vertebrae. And we have for our training data sets 11,000 of those out of only 100 patients, but quite a few visits. And we have also a test data set, which is 1,600 VUs. And on top of those, we also have labels. So we have the labels on the location of those VUs. So cervical is top of the spine, thoracic is the middle, lumbar is the bottom of the spine. And what we want is to generate a synthetic data set, but not any synthetic data set. We want a synthetic data set that has VU location, so has labels, and also that the data set in itself satisfies three core properties. First, fidelity, so that the images look realistic. We want the images to be, and the data set to be diverse and share the same data set behavior as real data, so diversity. And finally, privacy. So we want the synthetic data to not reproduce any real image, and also that it's not possible to just backtrack any training image by looking at synthetic data. So the code is accessible. We also have a paper that's available on arXiv. The code is commented and fully accessible, but cannot be run end to end because some of the data is restricted mostly for business reasons. And we do share synthetic data on there, and real data can be requested either to myself or the corresponding author. But feel free to take a look if you're interested by the presentation. The paper goes way more in depth and has way more figures and values on what I'm going to present. Now, a few words on generative models. So the type of architecture that we use is called GAN. And it's pretty popular, and I think most of you already have heard about it. So GANs are an architecture that, like, for example, generates the images on the top right and is pretty present in already commercial applications, like all these face app applications, for example. And it works by having two different networks that kind of compete against one another and both improve. And the end product is you start with a noise vector, a Z vector, and end up with images. The issue is that for our case, we don't just want images. We want something more. We also want labels. And so we use another type of architecture called AC-GAN, which starts with a label and a feature vector and ends up with an image that corresponds to this label. And this is very important because, for example, if you want an image of a cervical or a thoracic or a lumbar view, we can condition it. It's another case where we can see why it's useful is, for example, if you want to have images of lung of patients, but we want healthy lungs and diseased lungs, for example, or sick patients. Well, we don't want to have to decipher afterwards, after the fact, if the patient was sick or not. We want that the generated image already comes with a label. And so that's why we use this auxiliary classifier AC-GAN architecture. And then once we get this network trained, what we do is we just run this entire network on generation and create a data set of roughly the size of the original data set, so 10,000 images in our case. And then we apply and test out a few experiments there. So the first experiment we went through is fidelity, then which is making sure that the image look perceptually similar and perceptually realistic. Second thing is diversity. So once again, distribution and behavior are preserved compared to the original data set, and privacy. And for fidelity, what we did is basically a qualitative assessment. So making sure that the images look convincing for a human. And for that, I'll leave you a few seconds, but you can try to find out which one are real and which one are fake views. I guess it's going to be a bit complicated because you probably had never seen any views before the presentation. So it's probably even tricky for like doctors, but they're like, I mean, for myself or any people that's not from this part of like the medical corps, it's pretty hard. So the results are actually those ones. And I mean, by just taking a quick look, it's actually pretty hard to tell them apart. And we can say pretty safely that at least for realism and fooling humans, it's a good start. But we want to make sure that it goes way further than that. We want also that the data set, for example, conserves the same predictive power as the real data set, and that the distribution is similar as the original data set. And for that, this is where we use and test out diversity. So the first thing we test out in diversity is making sure that the distribution, the global distribution of our data sets, synthetic and real, are the same. So here the dark points are synthetic samples and the light points are real samples. And what you see is that in general, the span and the breadth of what's covered by the distributions are similar from one type of data set to the other. So we got this this representation by predicting with a UMAP. And what's also very interesting and what we can see is that the different classes, so cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, are also very well spread and conserved by the different by the synthetic data. So synthetic thoracic are the same place as synthetic as real thoracic images, for example. And And then we actually wanted also to have actual values, something that's a bit more quantitative. For that, what we did is we tried to assess the loss of data set feature. So what we did is we took the training set, which is F2305, and trained a classifier on that. So this is the blue classifier. And then we took our synthetic data set and trained another classifier. So same architecture, but different weights. Classified on the synthetic. And then we test both those classifiers on the testing data set. So our testing data set. And what we get are results that are actually extremely similar. So we get for binary classification, so one class against the other, very, very similar results from one type to the other. So that's like, once again, very promising, and it's actually quantifiable. So we can say that at least for this type of feature, it's pretty well preserved. And now let's get into privacy. So I'll be pretty succinct, obviously, like for matter of time, but there are way more things to say about that, and it's still something that's I guess very much interesting research direction. So differential privacy and general privacy for tabular data is something that's pretty well handled. But for images, it's not as easy as just applying differential privacy. I mean, mostly because of databases and the way people actually train models. And so for our case, we just focus on one type of attack, which is called membership attack, and making sure that it's not possible to trace back training images to the training set, only using synthetic data, obviously. And so this is by reducing and mitigating the probability of re-identification. And for that, we kind of find out two different types of attacks. So we have pairwise attacks, which is finding out a one-to-one correspondence between a synthetic sample and a candidate, so something that might be training. And the other one, it's a distribution attack, is basically finding a general trend within the sync data that betrays the presence of a training sample. And so we start here by pairwise attack. So once again, pairwise attack is finding a single synthetic image that matches a single other candidate image. And then this candidate image is basically like can be inferred to be training. So this often comes because of pure overfitting for the GAN, because, for example, the GAN just learns to copy training samples. And so here a small example would be you have those candidates, and well, this is a somewhat poor match. It looks like the same class, but it's not exact perfect match. He would have no match at all. Again, a somewhat poor match. And here we have an exact match. And this exact match is really unlikely if those are not exactly the same from the same distribution. So it's probably that this data point is from the training set. And then what we'd expect if we plot all those pair distances is that we'd be able to find out which candidates, if you have tons of examples, would come from the synthetic data. From the synthetic come from the training. And so, for example, small distances means like those are images that have high similarities, and high similarity mean those are probably from training. And what we'd expect is that low distances come from training, and high distances come from either a validation data set, so a fold of the training set that wasn't used in training, or test data set. And those would be the underlying distribution. And here, I mean, obviously in this third example, it's super easy to identify which come from training. You just have like two different modes, and the blue one is just like betraying everything. But what we get in practice is really different. We really don't get that poor of a behavior. We actually get pretty decent behavior, and basically validation and training are indistinguishable. For exact values and like quantitative approach, you can take a look into the article, but basically those you can't use a classification or anomaly detection algorithm to find about them. And for distribution attacks, so once again, it's finding a general trend, and what we call a general trend in our case is finding out a cluster. So basically lots of synthetic image that kind of look similar to one candidate image. Well, if you have a large cluster of synthetic image around one image, that's like problematic. That's probably from training. And so here, for example, this image doesn't look anything like synthetic. This doesn't look like anything like synthetic. And this, well, it's not exact match, but the distribution, the general trend is in this direction. So this one is way more likely to be from training. And so here, if we classify each image by a cluster size, so we look at how many synthetic image cluster in a small neighborhood around one data point, we'd expect that large clusters form around training and small clusters around validation and tests. And in this case, privacy would obviously not be preserved. So in blue, you have like training, super easy to find out. But what we see in practice that like, it's not that easy to find out. Once again, training and validation are pretty much impossible to tell apart. And even there is another issue, which is that because the definition of clusters is based on neighborhood, if your neighborhood is not large enough, then your training candidates don't even have a single neighbor. So the cluster is very, very tiny. So in conclusion, what you get is that pairwise attacks, well, they didn't prove any effective. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say that the way GANs overfit is not generally by reproducing exact samples. And so because especially of artifacts, so like when the GAN creates images, usually you have like artifacts on it. Those artifacts really reduce the possibility of matching one-to-one the images. And it works both in L2 and embedding space, by the way. And for distribution tags, they're more effective because you don't need an exact match, but the problem is you need bigger synthetic data sets, and data set, the size of the data set is defined by the user. So if you define it so that clusters are too small, it's not possible to identify like any type of training sample. So more generally, like it seems that like, we managed to train a GAN and to get a synthetic data set, and the data set satisfies fidelity, diversity, and privacy to some extent. So in general, I think it's safe to say that GANs are a very promising method for anonymization and prototyping, but there are a few limitations. And I think the biggest limitation is like the first point here, which is that we have a fixed privacy tolerance. So for example, if an application requires a higher privacy tolerance and we don't have it in the synthetic data set, we just have to throw it away because we can't change the privacy tolerance on that. And this is very interesting direction, which is to be able to change this fixed privacy tolerance, have a more flexible one. Another point would be to have multimodal generation, which is images and clinical. That's something we tried, but didn't manage to get any meaningful results, something that could be analyzed easily. So I think these are the two biggest points where we'd be interested to go further. So I'm basically done, but I really want to thank people that contributed to the work there, and especially Hangshi, who is the intern who really worked very hard on this project and did a great job. So thank you very much. That's all I had to say.
Thanks, Jason, for sharing this really interesting work. Because I mean, if you look at the challenges associated with accessing the data and kind of inability to use them, even for like training, to getting started with putting together a machine learning pipeline, then obviously this work becomes really, really important in that context. Now, one question that we have is, and you talked about it in context of the future work, is more about would including clinical data improve the quality of the image that is generated?
So I think that's a very good question, and it kind of depends. So the issue is that clinical data can also have absolutely no effect on the image. So for example, you could have a variable within the image that ends up having no impact on the output that you get. And this is something that kind of creates confusion within the network, because if you have a very large input condition, and some of those conditions have actually no effect on the network, then you create an environment where the network has trouble deciphering what it has to use within the initial input vector. Whereas in our case, the condition is very simple. And so the training is pretty simple. The issue is like if you start back propagating through something which has like is very noisy, you'll have more problem converging. And so, for example, I think the architecture we use is not very robust to use for varied clinical inputs, but there are some other architectures that could prove to be more powerful for that. And I think it's very important direction. It's just that if you want to evaluate the quality of your data set, you'd rather want to have something that's clinical, that's meaningful, and not something that's really fuzzy. And so that's why we went for that first, I guess. But yeah, I think definitely, I don't think clinical really improves the quality of the images, but I think it's very important to be able to generate them side to side.
Got it. I mean, another related question is, if you were to now associate the image to underlying disease conditions, so if you're looking into lesions or other things, there would be an association based on the underlying disease activity, where you would assume that in order to use the synthetic data to build out the pipelines that you would eventually use, your synthetic data needs to capture as much as possible the features and details of that kind of underlying activity, which then gets you a bit more closer to what you were talking about, the privacy attacks like pairwise or distribution attacks. So in that context, is it more about then sort of really generating the synthetic data so that it is like different from the actual samples? Or is it also could be that, for example, if you have certain features for a smaller, let's say a subpopulation, then you may exclude that from the data and sort of, preserve for privacy, not from a, generation or, perspective, but more from a process and approach perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I think both directions are very good directions. I think the direction of excluding things that are too specific to subgroups of population is definitely something that has to be kept in mind. Obviously, you're going to alter the data set that you have, but in some cases, it's probably better to just do it that way. But I think at the same time, being able to generate full clinical, for example, uh, data, and then use this full private data that's been generated, like synthetic clinical data, as a condition for an image generation process would be a very good idea as well. So I think it really depends on, once again, how specific your data is, and can you afford throwing away some of that's like outlier data.